Cerebral white matter organization. Substantia alba cerebri. Start a table. We divide cerebral substantia alba into association fibers, which connect areas within a hemisphere. Cord fibers, which either directly connect areas on opposite sides of the neuroaxis or provide an important step in that cross-axis connection. And striatal fibers, which provide communication between the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia. Association fibers within hemisphere. Cord fibers. So there are three types. Association fibers, cord fibers, striatal fibers. We draw a coronal section through the brain. Factors appreciate and what distinguishes these fibers projections. Include a separate section for nomenclature. Begin with a short association fiber, also known as U-fiber or arcuate bundle. Wait, I need my glasses. Short association fibers travel between gyri, just underneath the innermost in the innermost cerebral cortical gray matter layer 6. Certain white matter diseases, such as subtypes of multiple sclerosis, spare the short association fibers. Next, draw a mid-range association fiber, also known as neighborhood association fiber, which extends into the deep white matter to connect areas to a mid-distance away from one another. Finally, draw a long-distance association fiber, called a long association fiber. Long association fibers extend deep into the brain and connect distant ipsihemispheric regions. Their trajectory is best seen in sagittal view. We will learn about the long association fibers, which connect far-reaching areas, in detail separately. They include the arcuata fasciculus, which is classically, although probably erroneously, assigned as the pathway that passes language between the motor and sensory centers, and the cingulum, which passes through the limbic lobe and plays a key role in emotional processing. Long association fibers. Okay. Next, draw a prototypical striatal fiber projection from the cerebral cortex into the basal ganglia. Projections from throughout the cortex synapse in the basal ganglia and are evidentiary of the widespread role of the basal ganglia in behavioral as well as motor functions. Indicate that the two types of striatal fiber bundles are the Muratov bundle, also known as subcallosal fasciculus. Where is that? Okay, and the external capsule. Where is the internal capsule? Oh, here is the. Now we will draw the cord fibers which connect opposite sides of the nervous system. They subdivide into the commissural and subcortical fiber bundles, and they form the dense aggregate of deep white matter underneath the cortical gray matter. Draw a transverse-oriented commissural fiber connection from one side of the cortex to the other. The key commissural fibers are the anterior commissure and the corpus callosum. The latter roughly contains 300 million myelinated axons. Commissural fibers. Next, draw two vertically oriented representative subcortical projection fibers, an ascending one from the thalamus to the cortex called the thalamic bundle, and a descending one from the cortex to the opposite side of the brainstem, called the pontine bundle. The core fibers form the deep white matter region between the cortex and the encephalon. Indicate that the centrum semi-ovale refers to the white matter above the level of the lateral ventricles and the corona radiata, which lies at their level. The corona radiata, which lies at their level. It's synonym for radiating crown, which is appreciable only in detailed anatomical dissection. Now let's draw the internal capsule in axial view. It's an important location of restricted cerebrovascular infarct. Include key landmarks: the frontal horn and body of the lateral ventricles, thalamus, and the basal ganglia, putamen, globus pallidus, and nucleus caudatus head. Show that the internal capsule forms a V-shaped wedge in between key basal ganglia structures. It comprises fiber bundles that originate from widespread brain regions, and it carries fibers of many disparate functional modalities, including motor, sensory, cognitive, and emotional fiber pathways. Indicate that the anterior limb lies between the head of the caudatus and the lentiformis nucleus. Then show that the genu is the middle band of the internal capsule, which occurs along the medial lateral plane of the anterior thalamus. Indicate that the posterior limb lies between the thalamus and the lentiformis nucleus, the combined putamen globus pallidus. Next, show that the retrolenticular limb lies posterior to the posterior limb. Its fibers run posterior to the lentiformis nucleus, and finally not the sublenticular limb. Its fibers run underneath the lentiform nucleus and lie inferior to the plane of this diagram. As a simplification, we commonly associate the fascial fibers purely with the genu. The arm fibers descend through the anterior portion of the posterior limb. The leg fibers originate posterior to the arm fibers and pass anteriorly during their descent through the posterior limb. Interaction of the genu and posterior limb of the internal capsule produces a classic and commonly pure motor stroke. Genu, posterior limb. Interestingly, the motor fibers crowd together inferiorly within the internal capsule. Thus, the more inferior the infarct, the broader the motor deficit relative to the size of the infarct. Okay, let's draw. Okay, commissural fibers and disconnection syndromes. Here we will draw the commissural fibers which connect corresponding areas of the cerebrum, notably the corpus callosum, which connects dorsal cortical areas, and the anterior commissura, which connects ventral areas. First, draw hashed lines to show the anterior commissura bundle, which connects the bilateral ventral posterior frontal lobes and also the bilateral anterior temporal lobes. Then draw the corpus callosum fibers, which connect the bilateral hemispheres from the frontal to the occipital poles. Indicate that the frontal fibers are called the anterior forceps, also known as forceps minor, frontal forceps, and that the occipital fibers are called the posterior forceps, also known as forceps major, occipital forceps. Next, let's draw a sagittal view of the corpus callosum to show its four regions. Label the anterior inferior portion of the corpus callosum the rostrum, the anterior superior portion the genu, which is the anterior band, The length of the corpus callosum, the body, and the posterior portion, the splenium. Redraw the corpus callosum and show that the prefrontal fibers run through the rostrum and genu. The frontal fibers run through the anterior body, the temporoparietal fibers run through the posterior body, and the temporo-occipital fibers run through the splenium. Now return to our axial diagram and indicate that the genu fibers correspond to the anterior forceps, the anterior forceps. The splenial fibers correspond to the posterior forceps, and the body fibers correspond to the mid portion of the callosum. The rostral fibers run beneath the genu and are inferior to the plane of this axial section. Oh, okay. Anterior smaller commissural fiber pathways exist, including the hippocampal commissure, which lies inferior to the splenium of corpus callosum and connects the bilateral hippocampal formations, and the posterior habenular and supraoptic commissures. The function of the commissural fibers has aroused great interest through the past several centuries, and although the commissural fibers have long been understood to provide interhemispheric communication, the full extent of their function is still not known. Functional analysis of the corpus callosum suggests a role for it in both sensory integration and high-level cognitive processing. Okay. Much of what is known about the functional analysis is like MRI, fMRI or something. Much of what is known about the commissural bundles, however, comes from callosal resection surgeries, which are still done today to prevent the transmission of epileptic activity between the cerebral hemispheres, for example, to stem the propagation of seizures. And from commissural fiber disruption injuries, which can result in disconnection syndromes. Here we will address two major disconnection syndromes, pure alexia without agraphia and alien hand syndrome. In 1892, Xury memorably described the syndrome of pure alexia without agraphia, which is a syndrome in which patients are unable to read but are still able to write. To illustrate the anatomical underpinnings of alexia without agraphia, draw an anatomical axial section through a mid-height of the cerebrum. Then label the language center in the left superior temporal gyrus. Next, label the left visual cortex, then the right visual cortex, and then the splenium of the corpus callosum. Indicate that the left visual field directly communicates with the language center. Whereas the right visual cortex projects to it through the splenium of the corpus callosum. Now show that in pure alexia without agraphia, there is a posterior cerebral lesion that affects the medial left posterior occipital lobe and the related visual projection fibers, and indicate that the lesion also involves the right visual projection fibers. After they have crossed midline and within the splenium of the corpus callosum. Okay. From this lesion, the left visual center is directly cut off from the language center, and the communication between the right visual center and the language center is disrupted from the injury to the corpus callosum. But the language center still connects with the motor areas, so writing is preserved. Left posterior cerebral artery infarction is a most is a common cause of alexia without agraphia. Note that a coincident right homonymous hemianopy often occurs in this syndrome due to the left posterior occipital injury. And also note that our diagram is an anatomical drawing, opposite orientation of a radiographic view. Alien hand syndrome, also known as alien limb sign, is a disconnection syndrome with three overlapping variants. We will address their key manifestation, localization, and dominance. The callosal variant manifests with intermanual conflict or so-called self-oppositional behavior. It is most commonly caused by a lesion in the anterior corpus callosum, and the non-dominant hand, for example the left hand, is the most commonly affected, meaning the left hand opposes the action of the right. The frontal variant manifests with involuntary grasping, groping, or manipulation of objects. The lesion is most commonly in the dominant hemisphere, and the dominant hand, for example the right hand, is most commonly affected. Left anterior cerebral artery infarction is a notable cause of this variant of alien hand syndrome. Did it just mean fidgeting? I don't know. The sensory variant manifests with limb ataxia, non-dominant hemispheric parieto-occipital lobe lesions cause this iteration of alien hand syndrome. Thus, the left hand, for the non-dominant hand, is most commonly affected. Corticobasal degeneration, a neurodegenerative cause of dementia, is a classic cause of this alien hand syndrome variant. Okay. Wait, are we recording? We are. Yes, we are. Wait for a while, we'll finish it. Should we do a marathon? Don't. Wait, I'll be right back. I'll be right back. Right back. Shouldn't have attended the formal dinner. Or, more correctly, shouldn't have eaten anything until the formal dinner. Okay. But seriously, it was an unforgettable experience. Wait, what happened? Okay, let's do it again. Where's my glasses? So, Okay, let's go to the next section. Let's see what we can find. Apraxia and neglect. Here, we will address the anatomy of apraxias and neglect. Starter table indicates that, in simple terms, an apraxia is an inability to perform a perfect purposeful action in the setting of preserved overall neurological function and is more common with less brain injuries, whereas neglect is a lack of regard for objects in the contralateral hemisphere and is more common with right brain injuries. Neglect. Draw left lateral hemisphere. For reference, include the following sushi: central, precentral, and intraparietal. Indicate that apraxias can be further subdivided into the frontally based executive apraxias, which affect movement, and the posterior apraxias, which affect sensory skills and sensory motor planning. Show that in regard to the executive apraxias, limb kinetic apraxia occurs from injury to the premotor area. Indicate that in limb kinetic apraxia, there is impairment in finely graded finger movement and awkwardness of the arm and hand. Manifesting with an inability to rhythmically open and close the affected hand. Like this. In speech apraxia, which is a slowing and incoordination of speech in the presence of otherwise normal language and sound vocalization. There is injury to what is referred to in this context as the left precentral gyrus of the insula. Regarding the posterior apraxias, indicate that injury to the left hemispheric temporoparietal junction produces ideational apraxia. An injury left hemispheric temporoparietal junction. An injury to the left inferior parietal lobe injury and produces ideomotor apraxia. Note that ideomotor apraxia also occurs through disconnection phenomenon from injury to the premotor cortex and anterior corpus callosum. By at least one accepted definition, ideational apraxia is an inability to correctly conceptualize an action, but variations in definitions of ideational and ideomotor apraxia exist. For instance, patients with ideational apraxia might brush their teeth with a spoon, okay, or may be unable to sequence a complex action, meaning the for instance, that rather than putting a letter into an envelope, they might seal the envelope and then try to stuff the letter into it. Ideomotor apraxia is a failure to know how to perform a complex motor movement. Gestures, such as waving goodbye, are more severely affected than concrete movements, such as using an actual tool. Indicate that injury to the superior parietal lobule has traditionally been considered at the site of optic ataxia, also known as visuomotor ataxia. Note, however, that the actual lesion site for optic ataxia may lie more infero-posterior at the parieto-occipital junction. Optic ataxia manifests with an inability to accurately reach for objects due to visual guidance impairment. Indicate That optic ataxia is one of three important features of Balint syndrome, which is due to bilateral occipitoparietal lesions. The other two features of Balint syndrome are gaze apraxia, also known as oculomotor apraxia, or optic apraxia, which is an inability to direct the eyes toward the intended target. Instead, the eyes fixate on random objects or wander aimlessly, and simultaneosia, which is the visual fixation of a part of an object and an inability to see the object for its whole. Okay, indicate that Gerstmann syndrome occurs from injury to the left hemispheric inferior parietal lobule, with specific involvement of the angular gyrus. It is a four-part syndrome of left-right disorientation, finger anosia, which is a finger naming disorder, dyscalculia, which is a calculation disorder, and dysgraphia, which is a writing disorder. Now draw a right lateral hemisphere. Indicate that hemispatial neglect may be as mild as to cause extinction to double simultaneous stimulation, meaning that patients will perceive a sensory stimulus on the left side when it is presented only to that side, and neglect the stimulus when it is presented on both sides. Or it may be as severe as to cause failure to attend to the left half of the world entirely. Show that large right parietal lobe injuries can cause anosognosia, which is a lack of awareness of the presence of a deficit. Short term of this music.